Well, let's talk about the global economy. I mean, we live in a global economy right now. Would the U.S. lead the rest of the world out of recession? What about China? China has come up with a stimulus package as well.
The Chinese economy, which is hard to read because I don't know that we always know what's going on in the Chinese economy. I think it's still a fairly state-controlled
So it's not very transparent.
place. So it's not very transparent, and you're not always sure that the data you're getting is what's really reflective of what's going on. But to the extent that we know about it, it does look as if China has done the right things. First of all, they have a banking system that has not been linked to the global economy, so they weren't buying bad mortgages from the U.S. or making big loans to Eastern Europe or the things that have gotten everybody
So they were
else
more
into
conservative lender.
Well, they lent domestically. They lent to their own companies. I don't know, I would necessarily say they were conservative because they were putting a lot of money into some of the state-owned enterprises, which weren't always sound. But I think they have, because their overall rate of economic growth has been good, they've managed to avoid problems in their banking system. So that's a big plus for them. And then they were able to roll out a stimulus package that was very large relative to the size of their economy very quickly. And one sort of says, look, we all believe in democracy, but sometimes being a different kind of economy, you can do certain things more quickly. And they were able to roll out that package more quickly, and I think probably more effectively than most other countries. So, China is taking a substantial hit because it is has been an export-driven economy.
And the consumer spending decline in this country. And all over Europe.
And so, China, I think, is doing okay, but I don't think the Chinese consumer or even Chinese spending in itself is going to be large enough to pull the world out of recession. One day it'll be the biggest economy in the world, but right now it's not. It's still not a large enough economy, and certainly not in terms of its imports. It's not enough to be the engine of global growth. If you look at Europe, I find Europe rather scary when you look at the numbers in Europe. Now, and you look at the UK, which has had, obviously, the financial crisis has hit them as hard or even harder than the US. They're probably more dependent. I mean, the size of the, Royal Bank of Scotland and some of those other banks are very large compared to GDP.
Correct.
I was just talking to some folks from Ireland yesterday, and Ireland, which had looked so fabulous, had grown so rapidly, is just in a state of
Look at Iceland.
disarray. Iceland,
the basket case?
Complete basket case. So you've got a set of economies, Spain a little bit too, that got caught up with the real estate crisis. In fact, if you look at residential housing prices, some of the housing booms and the price booms were stronger in Europe than they were in the U.S. It's surprising, but so they actually had, they look at us and blame the United States for all these problems. They had their own housing booms, not Germany, but much of the rest of Europe. But of course, Germany's been hard hit because of the collapse of Eastern Europe and because of the collapse of exports. They are, of course, a premier exporter of capital goods, and in a global recession, capital goods is one of the things that gets hit very hard. So Europe is certainly in trouble, and I don't see Europe leading the global economy out of recession. Japan doesn't look too great either. Now, I was talking to people at the Federal Reserve, and they said, Japan's getting better. Don't worry so much. But I kind of look at what's happened to industrial production and exports and GDP.
It doesn't look the picture doesn't look very rosy.
The picture doesn't look very rosy. So maybe that I think from the Federal Reserve's perspective, maybe the banking system is in better shape than it was when they got into trouble at the end of the 80s. But the overall economy certainly doesn't look very good.
I want to talk a little bit about China complaining that the U.S. has unfair advantage because of the role of the dollars. I mean, they have complained many, many times. And by the way, I'm not going to put all the money in the Treasury fund, so on and so forth. Do you anticipate the dollar will lose its status as a reserve currency?
Well, eventually it may. I don't think it will anytime soon. I mean, clearly does the U.S. have an economic advantage through being a reserve currency? And the answer to that is yes. I don't know. I'm thinking about a comparison with Argentina, and obviously there's so many differences that complicates the story. But Argentina borrowed in dollars, and then when its economy got into trouble, its own currency collapsed, but all its debts were still in dollars. In the United States, if we borrow in dollars. It's our own currency. If the currency goes down, actually it means that our debts go down. So it is an advantage to the United States to be the reserve currency. There's no doubt about it. But does that mean that there's another currency that's going to come along and replace it? Well, what would be the alternatives? The renminbi is certainly not in a position it could play that role now. They are beginning to think about that. They're saying, okay, some of the transactions can be conducted in renminbi, but it's not a convertible currency, and it doesn't have, I think, the stature that it could exist as a global reserve currency. Europe is in, as we've said, is in worse shape probably than we are. So yes, I think people are diversifying between euros and dollars for their reserves, but I don't necessarily see the euro as coming in.
So is the dollar going to appreciate or depreciate?
I hate to answer that, particularly on camera. I'd hate to see anyone betting on my my forecast. If you ask me, if I look at the fundamentals, I would say the dollar looks to be about right compared to the Japanese yen and the euro. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to stay the same, because if the U.S. does recover before Europe, that will tend to attract capital into the United States, and you might actually see an appreciation. If Europe does better than I was expecting, then you'd see maybe some rise in the euro. So in terms of the fundamentals, I think it's probably about right at the moment. I think you're still going to see some appreciation of the renminbi over the next several years, because China's a developing country, and that's the pattern you tend to see as countries develop. But there's a lot of speculative movement, there's a lot of capital movements that can come in over a period of a couple of years.
So there's going to be fluctuation in terms of the dollar.
Going to be fluctuations. I think the people who make money trading in currencies have, an instinct for it. They're not economists particularly that do that.
Well, thank you very much for coming to our show.
You're very
I appreciate
welcome.
that very much. I'm sorry that we ran out of the time. Thank you very much. That's our show. Until next time, this is Frank Islam of FI Investment Group, wishing you a great week.